In the spring of 1975, 12-year-old Emily Collins vanished without a trace during a choir concert reception in Connecticut, leaving her parents devastated and desperate for answers. 15 years of fruitless searching passed before her father, Daniel, discovered a hidden letter inside her old cello. What it contained would shatter everything he thought he knew and set him on a perilous journey to uncover the chilling truth behind her disappearance. The spring night in Connecticut was crisp, with a slight breeze rustling the leaves outside St. Michael's Church. Inside, the sounds of a choir echoed through the stone walls, the last notes of a beautiful performance floating in the air. The choir's final song had just ended, and the congregation had begun to slowly filter into the reception hall for the celebration that would follow. It was a simple affair, just the parents, children, and local community members mingling over punch and hors d'oeuvres. The concert had been a success, and there was an air of contentment in the room. Among the children who had just performed was 12-year-old Emily Collins, the youngest and most promising member of the choir. Her high-pitched voice had cut through the air like a bell, and her parents, Daniel and Clara, couldn't have been prouder. They stood near the back of the hall, exchanging polite words with other parents, but their eyes kept drifting to their daughter. Emily was beaming, her face flush with excitement, talking animatedly with a group of friends by the punch table. It was meant to be a moment of joy, a night of celebration and music. Yet in the blink of an eye, everything changed. Daniel was standing by the window, sipping his drink, when he noticed Emily slip away from her friends and walk toward the back of the church. She glanced over her shoulder, smiled at her father, and then disappeared out of view. Daniel thought nothing of it at first. Perhaps she was just going outside to get some fresh air. It was a common enough gesture at these events, where the children would occasionally step outside for a brief reprieve. But as the minutes ticked by, he began to feel uneasy. He looked to Clara, who had also noticed Emily's absence. "Where's Emily?" Clara asked, her voice betraying a hint of concern. "I'm sure she's just stepped outside," Daniel replied, trying to shake the feeling that something was wrong. "I'll go check." He walked to the back of the hall, but Emily was nowhere in sight. The church was quiet now, save for the murmurs of guests catching up and the soft clinking of glasses. Daniel stepped out into the chilly night air, his breath coming in small clouds. He called her name. No answer. The parking lot was empty, the last of the late arrivals already having driven off. There was no sign of Emily. He called again, louder this time, the sound of his own voice echoing in the darkness. "Emily." His heart began to pound his chest as panic began to set in. He turned back to the building, scanning the area around him, desperate to find any trace of his daughter. Clara was already standing in the doorway when he returned. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with worry. "Daniel," she said in a breathless whisper, "I can't find her anywhere. I've asked everyone, no one's seen her." The first few minutes passed in a blur. People were still talking, unaware of the growing tension in the air. Clara went to the reception area, asking anyone she could find if they had seen their daughter. The guests, mostly parents and children from the choir, all gave the same confused responses. They had seen Emily earlier, but no one knew where she had gone. Panic slowly began to take hold of the room. Daniel's mind raced. His heart beat faster in his chest as the rational part of his brain tried to make sense of the situation. It was impossible. She couldn't have disappeared. Not here, not in front of everyone, not after the performance. "Maybe she went to the bathroom," Clara suggested, trying to hold on to the hope that there was a logical explanation. Daniel didn't answer. He was already on his way out the door again, walking briskly to the parking lot, his mind flooded with every possible worst-case scenario. They searched for what felt like hours: the parking lot, the nearby park, the alley behind the church, even the wooded area near the old cemetery. Emily was nowhere, and with every passing moment, the dread deepened. She had simply vanished. The police were called. The search intensified. The town rallied around them, organizing volunteers to help look for Emily. Flyers were posted. The church was searched again. The grounds surrounding the church were combed meticulously by local officers and volunteers. Yet despite every effort, there was no trace of Emily. No one had seen or heard anything. The days that followed were a blur of grief, confusion, and endless questions. The town of Brooksville was left in shock, unable to comprehend what had happened. How could a 12-year-old girl just vanish into thin air? And more importantly, why? It was the beginning of what would become 15 long, agonizing years of searching. For Daniel and Clara, every day felt like a lifetime. Time passed, but the questions never stopped. Every anniversary, every concert, every event, it was always the same. Emily was missing. The answers eluded them. And as the years wore on, the case grew colder. The police, once hopeful, eventually declared that there was little more they could do. The case was shelved, marked unsolved. But for Daniel and Clara, the search never stopped. There was always hope, faint as it might have been. And then, one day, in the quiet solitude of their attic, as the years of grief had worn down their resolve, Daniel made a discovery. It wasn't much, a forgotten relic of a time long past. The cello that Emily had practiced on for years, the one she had carried with her to every concert, was buried beneath dust and boxes. It had been left behind, an abandoned piece of her life. But as he moved to place it aside, something caught his eye, a faint mark on the cello's frame. It was a hidden compartment, and what he would find inside would change everything. 15 years had passed since Emily vanished. The house, once filled with laughter and music, now stood silent, its walls absorbing the grief that clung to the air like dust. Daniel's hair had grayed at the temples, his once sharp features softened by time and sorrow. Clara, too, had aged, though she wore her pain differently. She had learned to smile again, to live as best she could, but the hollow place where Emily had once been never filled. Every morning, Daniel rose early, as if the dawn might offer a new lead, a fresh clue. He checked the phone, as he had done every day for the past 15 years, despite knowing that there would be no calls, no messages. The police had long since stopped their inquiries, their notes gathering dust in forgotten filing cabinets. But Daniel never stopped searching. He had grown used to the stares in the town, the whispers behind closed doors, the awkward silences when people learned who he was. Some pitied him, others avoided him altogether. His obsession with finding Emily made him a ghost in his own life, a man disconnected from time, lost in the endless cycle of searching and waiting. The room that had once been Emily's now sat untouched. Her bed, still neatly made, served as a shrine to the girl who was no longer there. Her belongings were kept just as they had been the night she disappeared. Books half open on the desk, an old music box that played the same lullaby every time it was wound, and the cello, the one instrument that had once been her constant companion. Daniel had never been able to bring himself to part with any of it. There were days when he would stand in that room, staring at the small, seemingly insignificant objects that once belonged to his daughter, and he would whisper her name into the still air. He would sit at her desk, his fingers tracing the edges of her piano books, wondering if she had ever imagined the future he had planned for her, a future they had all dreamed of. Clara, on the other hand, had moved forward in some ways. She had a job at the local library now, organizing events and helping with community outreach. She had learned to put on the mask of normalcy, though Daniel could always tell when the weight of the years bore down on her. She would retreat into herself, her thoughts drifting to Emily, especially when she saw other young girls around the same age, laughing and playing without a care in the world. One evening, after a long day of work, Clara came home to find Daniel sitting in the living room, staring at the cello. The room was dim, and the soft hum of the ceiling fan was the only sound in the otherwise quiet house. "Daniel, go to wear yourself out," Clara said softly, sitting beside him. She reached for his hand, but he didn't respond. His gaze was fixed on the cello, the same cello that had been left behind all those years ago. "I don't know what else to do, Clara," he said, his voice hoarse. "I need to find her. I have to know what happened." "I know," Clara whispered. "I know you do. But we've done everything. We've looked everywhere. We've talked to everyone. We've been through all of this already. Sometimes I think she's gone, Daniel. And we need to let go." Daniel's heart ached at her words, but he couldn't bring himself to believe them. How could he let go of his daughter? How could he accept that she was lost forever when every day he lived with the hope that she was out there somewhere, waiting for him to find her? That night, as Clara went to bed, Daniel stayed up. He couldn't sleep. The cello sat across from him, its polished wood reflecting the dim light from the lamp. It was the only piece of Emily left, a symbol of her talent, her joy, and now, her absence. The next day, when the light finally began to seep into the attic, Daniel climbed the stairs slowly, the creaking floorboards beneath him a familiar sound. He had decided to sort through the things up there, to clear away the clutter that had built up over the years. It was time to confront the remnants of their past, to sift through the dust and try to find something, anything, that might lead him to Emily. As he opened the attic door, a small ray of sunlight streamed in from the cracked window, illuminating the room in a soft, golden light. Boxes were stacked haphazardly in corners, some labeled with old names and dates. He moved methodically, pulling items from boxes and setting them aside. Old newspapers, photographs, a collection of unused Christmas decorations. Nothing unusual. But then, as his eyes fell upon the cello, something strange caught his attention. There was a faint scratch on the side of the instrument, barely noticeable but still there. It was as if something had been carved into the wood, a deliberate, almost hidden mark. His fingers traced the line, and to his shock, the wood around the scratch gave way. There was a compartment, a hidden space in the cello. With trembling hands, he pried open the compartment. Inside, he found a small, folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. His heart skipped a beat. It was a letter from Emily. He hesitated for a moment before unfolding it carefully. The handwriting was unmistakable. Emily's delicate scrawl filled the page, but as he read the words, his stomach sank. The message was not what he had expected. It was cryptic, filled with strange symbols and phrases he couldn't understand at first glance. One word stood out: escape. Daniel's hands shook as he tried to comprehend what he was reading. It made no sense. What was this? What had Emily known? What had she been trying to tell him? The letter was a key that might finally unlock the mystery of what had happened to his daughter. And with it, the hope that he could bring her home, no matter how much time had passed. The piece of paper Daniel held in his hands trembled as his eyes scanned the cryptic letter again. Escape. The word felt like a weight pressing on his chest. He stared at it, the room around him fading into the background. The attic, with its dust and forgotten memories, seemed to close in. The sound of his heartbeat echoed in his ears, drowning out everything else. His first instinct was to go straight to Clara, to show her the letter, but something in the back of his mind held him back. No, this wasn't something he could share with her yet. Not until he understood what it meant. Not until he knew what Emily had been trying to say. Daniel carefully folded the letter, slipping it into the inside pocket of his jacket. He stood up slowly, wiping his clammy hands on his pants as he turned his gaze back to the cello. The violin, with its worn varnish and weathered strings, sat there, almost mocking him. It had been so easy to ignore it, to leave it behind in the attic, forgotten in the wake of their daughter's disappearance. Yet, now it seemed like the key to unraveling everything. He moved closer to the cello, examining the hidden compartment again. The scratch, the deliberate mark on the side of the instrument, felt like more than a coincidence. Whoever had created this secret compartment knew exactly what they were doing. This wasn't just a forgotten letter. This was a message, a sign that Emily had known something long before her disappearance. With careful hands, Daniel began to inspect the cello further, checking for any other hidden compartments or signs of tampering. He ran his fingers over the wood, feeling for any irregularities, any subtle clues that could lead him to more answers. His mind raced, considering the possibilities. Emily had been involved in something dangerous, something that had led to her disappearance. But what? The attic seemed to close in on him again as the silence stretched. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was on the brink of something huge, a discovery that could change everything. But there was still so much he didn't know, so much left to figure out. Daniel set the cello down gently and hurried to his study, where old notebooks, journals, and files filled the shelves. His eyes searched frantically as he flipped through papers. He was looking for anything that might explain what Emily had been involved with, any connection between the cryptic letter and the events that had transpired all those years ago. His hand trembled as he pulled out a large, yellowed file, labeled simply, the Collins case. It was the case that had been closed by the police so long ago. The case of his daughter's disappearance. Daniel hadn't looked at it in years, not since the initial investigation had fizzled out. The hope had died along with the case, but today, it felt different. Today, something had shifted. The letter, the cello, it was all leading somewhere. He flipped through the pages. Interviews, statements, maps, but nothing stood out at first. The usual dead ends, until he found a small note tucked between two papers, a report from an officer who had been present during the initial search. It was a simple observation, unusual activity near the church on the night of Emily's disappearance. A group of individuals seen in the vicinity. No formal investigation followed. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. A group of individuals? Had someone been watching Emily that night? Was her disappearance part of something bigger? He leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes and rubbing his temples. The pieces were starting to come together, but the full picture still eluded him. Who were these people? What had Emily gotten herself involved in? The letter she had hidden in the cello was no accident. It was a call for help, a warning that she had been in danger long before the night she vanished. But why had she hidden it inside the cello? Why not tell her parents directly? What had she been trying to escape from? A sudden thought struck Daniel like a lightning bolt. What if Emily hadn't been kidnapped? What if she had tried to escape something she had been forced into? The idea was terrifying. It suggested that someone or something had been pulling the strings in her life, controlling her every move. And worse still, they might have known exactly what she was trying to do. Daniel stood up, his mind racing. He needed answers. The time for waiting was over. He couldn't keep living in the past, retracing steps that led nowhere. He had to act. His eyes fell on the cello again, and the letter hidden inside it. He knew what he had to do next. He had to follow this lead wherever it took him, no matter where the road led. The first step was clear. He needed to find out who those people were. He needed to know what Emily had been running from. And maybe, just maybe, this letter, this long-hidden secret, was the key to finding her. The cello had been waiting all these years, just like he had. And now, it was time to uncover the truth. Daniel's fingers trembled as he held the letter, now carefully unfolded and laid out before him on the worn wooden desk. The room felt heavier than it had before, as if the very walls were pressing in around him, echoing with the weight of his thoughts. The words on the page, though simple, carried a weight that felt too heavy for him to bear. Emily's handwriting was unmistakable, her delicate, curly letters filled with urgency. But as he reread the letter again, something else struck him: the symbols. The words themselves were cryptic enough, but there were strange markings, odd shapes, circles with slashes, jagged lines cutting through curves. They resembled a language he had never seen before. This wasn't just a letter, it was a message, a desperate call wrapped in confusion. Emily had been trying to tell him something, but what? And why this strange code? Daniel stood up, pacing the room, his mind racing with possibilities. Had Emily known she was in danger? Had she been part of something so secretive, so dangerous, that she had to hide these warnings, even from her own parents? The letter was her final attempt to communicate, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. He needed more answers, and he couldn't find them alone. He needed help. After a few moments of hesitation, Daniel reached for his phone and dialed a number that he hadn't dialed in years. It rang 3 times before the familiar voice on the other end answered. "Harold," Daniel said, his voice tight. "I need your help." Harold Reed had been Daniel's college roommate and, more importantly, a linguist. He had studied languages of all kinds, including dead and ancient ones, which made him the perfect person to help decipher the cryptic symbols in Emily's letter. They hadn't spoken in years, not since Harold moved to New York for his academic career. But Daniel knew that if there was anyone who could help him, it was Harold. "I've got something, Harold. It's about Emily." The silence on the other end stretched before Harold's voice came back, tentative but intrigued. What about her? About something she left behind, Daniel said, his voice low. It's a letter, hidden in her cello. She wrote it before she disappeared, and I think it's the key to understanding what happened to her. He explained briefly, omitting only a few details about the letter's strange symbols. Harold listened quietly, then, after a long pause, agreed to help. They arranged to meet at Daniel's house the next day. The following afternoon, Harold arrived, his sharp eyes already scanning the room as he stepped into the living room. The old books and papers scattered across the desk didn't faze him. He had seen Daniel's obsessive nature before. What caught his attention, however, was the cello resting against the wall. It stood in stark contrast to the cluttered surroundings, its polished surface gleaming under the dim light. Is this it? Harold asked, gesturing to the cello as he sat down across from Daniel. Yes, Daniel replied. The letter was hidden inside. I need you to help me figure out what it means. Harold reached for the letter first, carefully taking it from Daniel's hands. His eyes moved over the page, the familiarity of his old training taking over. The symbols were strange, but not completely unfamiliar. These markings, Harold murmured, they resemble something I studied a while ago. It looks like a mix of ancient Celtic symbols with some other influences. This isn't just some random code. It's deliberate. Daniel's pulse quickened. So what does it mean? Can you decode it? I think so, Harold said, leaning back in his chair and examining the symbols more closely. But it's going to take time. I'll need to cross-reference these with some old manuscripts and sources I have. For the first time in years, Daniel felt a flicker of hope. They weren't far off. Harold's expertise could unlock the meaning of Emily's message. And perhaps, through that, they could finally understand the nature of her disappearance. As Harold worked, Daniel's thoughts drifted to Emily. His daughter had been so bright, so full of life. She had loved her cello, and she had loved singing with the choir. But now, it felt as if everything about her life, everything about what she had been involved in, was shrouded in darkness, secrets that she had never shared. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second echoing in the silence of the room. It felt like time had slowed. The afternoon light began to fade, casting long shadows across the floor as the hours passed. Finally, Harold looked up from the papers, his face pale but thoughtful. I think I've got it, he said, his voice quiet but firm. This symbol here, it's not just random. It's an old Celtic rune. It means freedom or escape, depending on the context. But the other symbols, he paused, searching for the right words. They don't belong to any known language I've studied. It's as if they were made specifically for this letter. Daniel felt his heart race as he leaned in. What does it mean, Harold? What is she trying to tell me? Harold studied the page one last time. This letter wasn't meant for you just to find. It was a warning. Someone or something was after her. This rune, it's not about a place, it's about a person or maybe a group. She was trying to tell you she was trying to escape them. And the symbols, there's some sort of cipher. It's a message, a secret communication. She was caught in something deeper than you know. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. You mean Emily wasn't just taken? She ran from something. Harold nodded slowly. I think she was running from something or someone dangerous. And she left you this clue, this message to warn you. Whatever it is, it's connected to her disappearance. Daniel stared at the letter, his mind reeling. All these years of searching, of piecing together fragments of his daughter's life, had led him here to this moment. The truth was finally beginning to unravel, and it was darker than he had ever imagined. We have to find out who did this, Daniel said, his voice hard with resolve. Whatever she was running from, we'll finish what she started. Harold nodded, the weight of the situation settling on both of them. There were more questions now than answers, and the road ahead would be dangerous. But Daniel had no choice. Emily had left him a trail, and he would follow it until the truth was revealed. The quiet in the room was palpable as Daniel stared at the cryptic symbols in front of him. Harold had taken the time to explain the possible meanings of some of the more recognizable characters, symbols of ancient runes, Celtic markings, and hidden references to myths and legends. But what was most unsettling was that many of the symbols didn't seem to belong to any known language or cultural origin that Harold could place. The room, once filled with the hum of the old fan and the soft tick of the clock, now felt suffocating with uncertainty. Every second felt like a potential discovery. Every movement of the pen across the paper by Harold an unraveling of deeper mysteries. Daniel couldn't sit still. His mind kept racing, replaying the years of searching, all the dead ends, all the questions that had never been answered. But now, in front of him, there was something real, something tangible. Emily had left him a map, a key to unlocking the truth, and it was written in a code he could barely understand. Harold, rubbing his temples, glanced up from the letter, his expression troubled. You see, the strange thing about these symbols, they're a blend of old and new, a combination of languages and codes that I've never seen before. And I'm not sure if Emily had the time or the knowledge to craft something like this herself. This letter might be older than you think. And it's clear, it's not just a warning. It's a call for help. It's telling you to find something, someone, and you need to understand the code if you want to follow it. Daniel clenched his fists, trying to control the rising panic in his chest. What does she mean by escape? His voice was barely a whisper, the weight of the word heavy on him. Is she telling me she ran from someone? A group? Harold nodded, his eyes still focused on the paper in front of him. That's the most logical conclusion. But the real question is who, or what, was she running from? Daniel shook his head, frustration growing. I need to know. I need to understand this. We'll get there, Harold replied, calm but determined. I'll need to do some deeper research. These symbols, they're not just random marks. They're part of a much bigger puzzle. It's a map, Daniel. A map to something or someone. If we break this code, we might just have the answer. Daniel could barely focus on the words Harold was saying. He felt like he was falling deeper into a hole with no way out. For so long, he had clung to the hope that Emily was just lost, that somehow she would come back, that she was out there, waiting for him to find her. But now, this new revelation, it felt like a slap in the face. Emily hadn't just been taken. She had been running, and someone or something had been chasing her. I can't wait any longer, Daniel said, his voice suddenly steely with determination. I need to find out who these people are. I need to know everything. Can you help me, Harold? Can you really crack this code? Harold looked at him seriously, nodding slowly. I'll help, but we need to take it step by step. We need to figure out the connections between the symbols first. The rest will follow. Daniel leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes. Where do we start? Harold flipped the letter over, tapping a pen on the back. There's a symbol here that's worth focusing on. It's an old Celtic knot, but it's distorted. Something about it feels off. It's like the shape of the knot is broken, but not in a random way. It's deliberate. If I'm right, this knot could represent a boundary, something or someone blocking her path. We need to find out who is in her way. Daniel's stomach tightened. A boundary? You mean she was trying to break free from someone? Harold's brow furrowed as he looked closely at the symbol. Exactly. This isn't just an escape. It's a warning. Emily was trying to leave, but whoever she was dealing with wasn't going to let her go easily. Daniel sat still for a long moment, staring at the letter. This wasn't just a puzzle. It wasn't just a mystery. It was a map to the very heart of his daughter's life. The things she had been involved in, the people she had tried to escape. It was all here in the code, in the symbols. And as much as he wanted to know the truth, he was beginning to realize just how dangerous it would be to uncover it. What kind of people was she running from, Harold? Daniel asked, his voice low. Harold's eyes darkened as he paused before answering. That's the part we don't know yet. But what I can tell you is this. These people didn't just disappear. They're still out there. And if Emily was involved in something this dangerous, they might still be looking for her. They might even be looking for you now. Daniel's pulse quickened at Harold's words. This was no longer just a search for his daughter. It was becoming something much larger, something far more sinister. The realization that he wasn't just chasing ghosts, that there was a real threat out there, made his blood run cold. We'll crack the code, Daniel, Harold said, breaking the silence. But you need to be ready. This won't be easy. And once we start down this path, there's no turning back. Daniel stood up, his eyes set with resolve. I'm ready. I've been waiting for this for 15 years. I'm not turning back now. The weeks that followed were a blur of activity. Harold immersed himself in research, working tirelessly to decipher the strange symbols in the letter. Daniel, meanwhile, began retracing Emily's last steps. Each lead felt like it might unravel a piece of the mystery, but none of it led him any closer to the truth. The more he uncovered, the more questions he had. And with each question came the creeping realization that Emily's disappearance was far more complex than he had ever imagined. The letter was only the beginning. It had opened a door, and now Daniel had to walk through it, no matter where it led. It was late one night when Harold called Daniel, his voice filled with excitement and a hint of apprehension. "Daniel, you need to see this. I think I've cracked it." Daniel felt a rush of adrenaline. After days of painstaking work, they were finally getting somewhere. He grabbed his jacket and headed out the door, the cold night air biting at his skin as he drove to Harold's apartment. He couldn't wait any longer. He had to know what the symbols meant. When Daniel arrived, Harold was waiting by his desk, a stack of papers spread out before him. "I found something," Harold said, his eyes gleaming with intensity. "This not symbol, it's not just a boundary. It's a marker. A signature." Daniel frowned. "A signature? What does that mean?" Harold pushed a piece of paper toward him. "It's not just a Celtic rune. It's the symbol of a secret organization, one that was active here in Connecticut during the 1970s. They operated in the shadows, pulling strings, infiltrating local institutions. They had ties to music schools, artists, and musicians, people like Emily. I believe she was involved with them." Daniel's heart sank as he looked at the paper. The symbol was unmistakable, too familiar, too deliberate. It wasn't just a coincidence. Emily had been a part of something far darker than he had ever imagined. This group, they were controlling people, Harold continued, his voice low, using their talents, their influence. But they weren't just about art or music. They were connected to a much bigger network, an underground society with connections to politicians, businessmen, and other powerful figures. The music, the art, it was all a cover. Daniel felt his breath catch. A cover for what? Harold hesitated before answering. For power. For control. This group used the arts to gain influence, to recruit people, to get them involved in their twisted plans. They preyed on young talents, people like Emily, promising them fame and recognition in exchange for their loyalty. But once you were in, there was no way out. Emily must have realized what they were really about, and that's when she tried to escape. The weight of Harold's words hung in the air, suffocating in its gravity. Daniel stared at the paper. The symbol burned into his memory. He had spent years looking for answers, but now, the answers were so much darker than he could have imagined. They controlled her? Daniel whispered. They used her? Harold nodded gravely. It's possible. Emily was talented. She had a beautiful voice. She was noticed by the wrong people. But what's worse, Daniel, is that this group didn't just disappear. They're still out there. And if Emily was running from them, they might still be looking for her. Daniel's mind reeled. This wasn't just a case of a missing girl. This was the story of a child caught in a web of control, manipulation, and hidden power. He had always feared something sinister had been behind her disappearance. But now he was starting to realize how deep the darkness went. The people who had taken his daughter hadn't just wanted to harm her. They had wanted to own her, control her. And they still might. What do we do now? Daniel asked, his voice trembling with urgency. Harold's expression darkened. We need to find out who's behind this. We need to expose them, or Emily's disappearance won't be the last. But be careful, Daniel. These people, this group, they're dangerous, and they don't leave loose ends. Daniel stood up, his fists clenched at his sides. I don't care how dangerous they are. I'm going to find them, and I'm going to find Emily. Harold looked at him with a mixture of concern and determination. I'll help you, but we need to go slowly. This is bigger than we realized, and the more we uncover, the more they'll try to stop us. The two men exchanged a silent understanding. They were now bound together in this pursuit, both driven by the same need for answers, but also by the same fear. This wasn't just about finding Emily anymore. It was about taking on a powerful, shadowy force, one that would stop at nothing to protect its secrets. Daniel stepped out of Harold's apartment into the cool night air, his mind racing. He had spent years searching for answers, clinging to the hope that Emily was still alive, that she could still be found. But now, the truth was so much darker than he had imagined. The people who had taken her weren't just hiding her. They were hiding themselves, and they would do anything to keep their secrets safe. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: he wasn't going to stop. He was closer than ever to finding Emily. And when he did, he would make sure the world knew the truth about the people who had taken her and the darkness they had tried to hide. The days blurred into nights as Daniel and Harold worked feverishly, uncovering fragments of information about the shadowy group that had ensnared Emily. Every lead seemed to open up new questions, but the deeper they dug, the more dangerous things became. Their pursuit of the truth had started to attract attention, unwelcome attention. It began with subtle signs. A car parked across the street from Daniel's house, sitting motionless for hours, watching. A note slipped under the door of Harold's apartment one evening. Just a few cryptic words scrawled on a piece of paper. Stop looking. But the threats soon escalated. One evening, as Daniel returned home from meeting with Harold, he noticed the front door of his house had been left slightly ajar. His heart skipped a beat. He hadn't left it open. His hand went to the small handgun he kept in a drawer for emergencies. He stepped inside cautiously, every sense on high alert. The house was eerily silent. Too silent. "Clara," he called, his voice thick with dread. But there was no answer. He moved through the house slowly, checking every room, his mind racing. What if they had come for her? What if the group had finally found him? But everything was undisturbed, save for a small detail that stopped him cold. The family photo album he and Clara had kept on the shelf, the one they had never dared to open, was on the coffee table, wide open. The page that had been turned to held a picture of Emily, smiling at her last choir concert. The edges of the photo had been cut, a clean, deliberate cut. Someone had been looking through their memories, their past, and had decided to mark it with a symbol of destruction. Daniel's chest tightened. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Someone had been here. Someone was watching him, trying to intimidate him, and they were getting bolder. Clara appeared in the doorway, her face pale, a look of fear in her eyes. She had been upstairs, unaware of what had happened. "What's wrong? What happened?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked over to the table, closing the photo album, his hand trembling. "Someone's been here. We need to be careful. They're watching us." "Who?" Clara whispered, her voice breaking. "Who's doing this?" "I don't know yet," Daniel said, his voice rough. "But we're not stopping. Not now." The next day, Daniel received a phone call that would change everything. The number was unfamiliar, but the voice on the other end was unmistakable. "You've been asking questions you shouldn't, Mr. Collins," the voice said, calm, almost too calm. "And we don't like it when people go digging into things that don't concern them." Daniel's heart pounded in his chest, but he kept his voice steady. "Who is this?" The voice laughed softly. "We know what you've been up to. The letter you found, the symbols, it's all been planned. You're getting too close, Mr. Collins. Your search is over." The line went dead. Daniel stood frozen, his mind racing. They knew. They knew everything. Whoever had been watching him, whoever had orchestrated Emily's disappearance, was now taking the gloves off. This wasn't just a search anymore. This was a battle, and Daniel was being dragged into it, whether he was ready or not. That night, after a tense dinner with Clara, Daniel made a decision. He couldn't wait anymore. He couldn't hide from this. The people who had taken Emily weren't just going to leave him alone. They were going to come for him. And if they didn't know exactly who he was, they would soon find out. He called Harold and arranged a meeting. They would have to confront this head-on. When Daniel arrived at Harold's apartment, the air between them was thick with the weight of what was to come. Harold had gathered more information, new leads, new names, new connections. But the more they learned, the more dangerous the situation became. "This isn't just about Emily anymore, is it?" Daniel asked, his voice low. Harold met his gaze, his expression grim. "No, this is about a network, a shadow organization that controls everything, from artists to politicians to businessmen. They've been pulling strings for decades, Daniel. Emily was just a small piece of the puzzle. But you've opened Pandora's box. Daniel exhaled sharply. So what now? Harold's eyes were dark with the weight of their discovery. We can't do this alone. We need to go to the authorities. But they'll be watching us, Daniel. Every step we take. Then we take a different route, Daniel said firmly. We go to the media. We expose them. Harold shook his head. That's a dangerous game to play. These people have connections everywhere. They won't hesitate to silence us if they need to. Daniel's jaw tightened. Then we fight back. They took Emily. They ruined her life. And now they've come after us. I'm not going to let them get away with it. Before Harold could reply, the door to the apartment burst open with a force that sent both men jumping to their feet. Two shadowy figures stood in the doorway, their faces obscured by dark masks. They didn't say a word, they just advanced. Daniel's heart stopped, but his instincts kicked in. "Harold, get down," he shouted, pushing his friend to the floor as the first figure lunged toward him. The sound of struggle filled the room, a mix of grunts and heavy breathing. The other figure grabbed Harold, pinning him down with surprising strength. Daniel's thoughts moved like lightning. He had to act fast. He scrambled for the lamp on the desk and swung it with all his might, knocking the first figure to the ground. But the fight wasn't over. The man quickly recovered, pulling a knife from his belt, the blade glinting in the low light. Daniel's heart was pounding, but he was fueled by nothing but rage and fear. This was his daughter's fate, his family's life. Everything was on the line now. He had to survive. He had to protect Harold. He had to uncover the truth, no matter what the cost. The chaos in the apartment seemed to stretch into eternity, the struggle unfolding like a slow-motion nightmare. The masked figure Daniel had struck with the lamp was back on his feet, blood trickling from a gash on his forehead, but he wasn't backing down. The air was thick with tension, every movement sharp and desperate. Daniel was running on pure adrenaline, his heart racing as he blocked another swing from the man with the knife. Harold was on the floor beside him, struggling to free himself from the second figure's grip. The man was bulky, a professional in the art of restraint, his fingers digging into Harold's shoulders. But Harold wasn't going down without a fight either. His legs kicked out, knocking the man's knee out of position. The second figure grunted in pain, stumbling back. That was enough. "Get up. Now," Daniel shouted. Harold didn't hesitate. He rolled away from the man and scrambled to his feet. In a swift motion, he grabbed the chair that had fallen to the floor during the struggle and swung at the attacker. It connected with the man's chest with a loud crack, sending him stumbling backward. Daniel didn't wait. He lunged toward the first attacker, knocking the knife from his hand and tackling him to the ground. They both rolled across the floor, a blur of fists and grunts. For a brief moment, Daniel thought he might lose control. The man beneath him was too strong, but the memory of his daughter, the thought that these people had been the ones who'd taken her, who'd ruined her life, kept him going. He had to finish this. He had to end this. He managed to pin the man's arms to the floor, using his body weight to his advantage. His breath came in ragged gasps as he pressed his forearm against the man's throat, pushing harder with each passing second. The figure struggled, but the fight was leaving him. Soon enough, his eyes closed, his body going limp under Daniel's force. "Daniel, stop!" Harold's voice cut through the haze of anger. Daniel blinked, his heart pounding in his ears, and slowly looked up. Harold was standing by the door, holding a gun in his hand, his face pale. The second attacker, the bulky one, had pulled himself together just enough to lunge for the door. Harold didn't hesitate. He fired once, the sound echoing in the room, deafening. The man crumpled to the ground, a single shot to his leg enough to stop him in his tracks. He let out a low groan, but the struggle was over. He couldn't move, couldn't fight anymore. Daniel stood there for a moment, his hands still shaking, his chest rising and falling with each breath. The room was silent now, save for the men's labored breathing. His mind was still racing, the adrenaline from the fight pumping through his veins. "Harold, we need answers." Daniel's voice was ragged, but there was no mistaking the resolve behind it. He wasn't done yet. Harold nodded, his eyes grim. "We'll get them. After calling the police, Daniel and Harold waited in the apartment, watching the two men who had attacked them. The authorities arrived shortly after, and the scene was quickly secured. As officers took the masked figures into custody, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. This was only the beginning. The leader of this mysterious group was still out there, still watching, still pulling strings. He had no doubt now that these men were just pawns in a much bigger game. Daniel, his hands now steady, approached one of the attackers. The man was handcuffed, bruised, but very much alive. Daniel knelt down in front of him, his eyes cold, his tone sharp. "Who are you working for?" Daniel demanded, leaning in close. "What do you want with my daughter?" The man's lips curled into a cruel smile, his eyes narrow slits behind the mask. He didn't speak at first, but Daniel wasn't going to let him off that easily. The man had no choice. "I know you're scared," Daniel said, his voice low, "but the more you hold out, the worse it will get. Tell me who you work for, and maybe, just maybe, you'll get a chance to survive this." The man chuckled, his voice strained. "Survive? You think you're the one who gets to decide that? You're in over your head, Collins. They know you're looking. They'll come for you." Daniel's heart skipped a beat. The threat was unmistakable. "Who are they?" Daniel pressed again, the desperation creeping into his voice. "Tell me, and I'll make sure this goes easy for you." The man met his gaze, his eyes full of defiance. But then he smirked again. "You want to know? Fine, but it won't help you. They're everywhere. You've opened Pandora's box. Now you're part of the game." With that, he went silent, refusing to give any more information. As the police took the attacker away, Daniel and Harold were left standing in the wreckage of the apartment, the weight of the revelation hanging heavily in the air. The attackers had been members of the very group they had been investigating. They had been sent to stop them, to intimidate them. But this was no longer about just finding Emily. It was about something much bigger. "They know we're onto them," Harold said quietly, his voice thick with concern. "And they're not going to stop until we're silenced." Daniel's eyes darkened with the realization that the stakes were much higher than he had ever imagined. The group behind Emily's disappearance wasn't just a secret society. They were a dangerous force with far-reaching power. They had infiltrated every part of society, hidden in plain sight. And now, they were coming for him. But Daniel had no intention of backing down. He was closer to finding Emily than ever before. And no matter how dangerous it became, he wasn't going to stop. He had to get to the truth for Emily and for everyone who had fallen victim to the darkness that these people represented. The last few days had been a blur of tension and fear, but now Daniel stood on the precipice of everything he had been fighting for. The door in front of him was the gateway to the truth. Night Security's hidden headquarters, the heart of the organization that had taken his daughter and orchestrated her disappearance. He had followed every lead, uncovered every secret, and now it was time to confront those responsible for the darkness that had haunted his family for so long. Harold stood by his side, his face tense with the same mix of determination and fear. They had no illusions anymore. This wasn't just a simple search. It was a battle. The organization they were up against was vast, powerful, and willing to do anything to protect its secrets. But it didn't matter now. Daniel was prepared to fight, no matter the cost. The building was cold, its polished exterior masking the shadows that lurked within. Every step Daniel took inside felt like a step further into the unknown. They split up, Harold taking the back entrance, Daniel heading toward the front. The plan was simple: find the evidence they needed, expose the organization, and get out alive. But they both knew things would never be that easy. Daniel moved quickly down the dimly lit hallways, his heart pounding in his chest. Every door felt like a potential threat, but he couldn't waste time thinking about that. He had one goal: to uncover the truth. Finally, at the end of the hallway, Daniel found it, the door to the office he'd been looking for. He pushed it open, his mind racing as he entered the room. The air was stale, the dim light casting long shadows across the room. On the desk before him were several files, scattered papers, and a computer. Daniel didn't hesitate. He immediately went to the desk, his eyes scanning the papers. What he found made his blood run cold. There it was at the bottom of the list: Emily Collins, the name that had haunted him for years. Her contract was short but chilling, written in stark, cold terms. Artistic development, long-term collaboration, termination by voluntary withdrawal or organization discretion. His hands shook as the weight of the words settled in. Emily hadn't just been taken. She had been trapped, controlled, used. And this was only the beginning. The realization crashed down on him like a wave. This was much more than just a kidnapping. This was a conspiracy, a dark and twisted manipulation of lives, a network of people using power and influence to control others. Before he could process the full implications of what he had uncovered, the door to the office crashed open with force. "Step away from the computer." The voice came with an edge of command and warning. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. It was the man from the phone, the one who had threatened him earlier, the one who had been watching, waiting. Daniel stood frozen for a moment, but his instincts kicked in. He turned quickly, meeting the man's cold, calculating eyes. The gun was raised, aimed directly at Daniel. The man's voice was smooth but laced with venom. "You've gotten too close. You don't know who you're dealing with." But Daniel wasn't about to back down. Before he could make a move, Harold burst into the room, throwing a chair at the man, knocking him off balance. The gunshot rang out, deafening, but the bullet missed Daniel by inches. Chaos erupted in an instant. The man scrambled to regain his footing, but Harold and Daniel didn't give him the chance. The fight was quick, brutal, but it felt like the culmination of everything that had been building up for years. Daniel lunged at the man, knocking the gun from his hand, and tackled him to the ground. They rolled across the floor, each struggle bringing Daniel closer to the moment he had been preparing for. This was the man who had been part of the organization that took Emily, the one who had pulled the strings in the shadows. And now, Daniel wasn't going to let him go. The man fought back, but Daniel was fueled by years of pain and frustration, by the hope of finally finding Emily and exposing the truth. With one final move, Daniel pinned the man down, his arms holding the attacker in place. The man's struggles weakened, and soon he was still. Daniel stood up, his chest heaving with exertion. He turned to Harold, who was catching his breath. "We need to get to the computer," Daniel said, his voice low and determined. There was no time to waste. The truth was within reach. The two men moved to the computer, their hearts pounding as they quickly accessed the files. The documents on the screen were a web of connections, names, and dates, proof of the organization's reach and its hold over countless lives. Emily's contract was just one piece of the puzzle. There are dozens of other names, all involved in the group's operations, all victims of the same manipulation. And at the top of the list were the true masterminds, the people who had used Emily, who had used countless others, as pawns in their dark game. "This is it," Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is what they've been hiding." Harold nodded, his eyes wide as he scanned the documents. "We've got everything we need. This is the evidence we can use to expose them." But just as they thought they had won, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed down the hallway. The urgency of their situation hit them both at once. "They know we're here," Harold said, his voice grim. "We need to move." Daniel's pulse raced, but there was no turning back. They had come this far, and there was no way they were leaving without the truth. They gathered the files quickly, determined to get out of the building alive. But the feeling of being hunted was real now. They weren't just fighting to expose the truth, they were fighting to survive. As they rushed toward the exit, Daniel couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. They had uncovered the darkness, and now it was up to them to bring it to light. The truth had been exposed, but the fight wasn't over. And as they stepped into the night, they knew one thing for certain. They weren't going to stop until they had exposed every last secret, no matter the cost. The cold night air hit Daniel's face as he and Harold stepped out of the building, their footsteps echoing in the alley behind night security. The weight of the files in Daniel's hands felt heavier than it ever had before. They had gotten the evidence, proof of everything that had been hidden for so long. But now the question was, what would they do with it? The moment they had walked out of the building, Daniel knew they were no longer safe. The people who had been watching them were now aware that their secrets were on the verge of being exposed. The fear that had been simmering in the back of his mind since he first started his search for Emily had now solidified into a gnawing certainty. Their lives were in danger. Harold glanced at Daniel, his face lined with exhaustion. "We need to get this to the authorities, Daniel. The police, someone with the power to take them down." Daniel shook his head, his thoughts already racing ahead. "We can't trust them. The organization's influence runs deep. Whoever we go to will just end up being one more piece of the game. We need to go public. We need to expose them to the world." "But the media," Harold began, his voice trailing off, realizing the gravity of Daniel's decision. "We don't have a choice," Daniel cut him off. "The longer we wait, the more time they have to cover their tracks. If we give them time to bury this, it's over." Harold hesitated, but nodded in agreement. "You're right. It's the only way." They moved quickly through the shadows, careful not to attract attention. Daniel knew that the longer they stayed out in the open, the more likely it was they would be followed. The fear of being hunted was now a constant companion, but the urgency of their mission kept them moving forward. The next morning, they did what they had been planning for weeks. They reached out to a trusted investigative journalist, someone who had spent years uncovering corruption and exposing hidden truths. A man named Nathan Cole, known for his unflinching commitment to justice. Daniel had worked with him before, back when he had first started searching for Emily, and he knew Nathan would understand the importance of what they had uncovered. By the time the afternoon sun had dipped low in the sky, Nathan was sitting across from them in a small cafe, the atmosphere tense as he listened to their story. Daniel handed him the files, pages of contracts, names, dates, and detailed accounts of the organization's operations. Nathan took them, his expression unreadable. "You're sure about this?" Nathan asked, his eyes flicking to the documents. "This is big. If what you're saying is true, this is the story of a lifetime. It could bring down a lot of people." Daniel nodded, his throat tight. "It's all true. Emily was just one of many. They used her, and then they threw her away when she tried to escape. These people control everything. I'm not stopping until I get justice for her, and for everyone they've hurt." Nathan studied him for a long moment, and for a brief instant, Daniel saw a flash of doubt in his eyes. But then Nathan spoke, his voice low but resolute. "I'll help, but you're right about one thing. It's going to be dangerous. The people behind this won't go down without a fight. You have to be ready for what's coming." Daniel's heart raced. He had no illusions. He knew that exposing the truth meant risking everything. The people who had taken Emily weren't going to let them go without a fight. But as he looked at Nathan, something inside him hardened. He had come too far to turn back now. "We're ready," Daniel said, his voice steady, though his mind was still reeling from everything he had learned. "I've already lost everything. I'm not going to lose this fight too." Nathan sighed, a slight nod acknowledging the gravity of the decision. "Then we move forward. But you need to be prepared. There will be retaliation. These people don't just disappear. They'll do whatever it takes to stop you." The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Nathan worked tirelessly, contacting the right people, connecting the dots, and preparing the story for release. Daniel and Harold stayed in the shadows, constantly on alert, never staying in one place for too long. They knew it was only a matter of time before the organization realized their files had been taken and their secrets were exposed. And then, one morning, the story broke. It wasn't just a small piece in the corner of the newspaper. It was everywhere. News outlets, social media, television broadcasts. Night security was exposed for what it truly was. A front for a criminal network operating in the shadows, using art and music as a cover for its illicit activities. The truth was out. The backlash was immediate. Government officials, businessmen, even celebrities who had been linked to the group began to scramble, distancing themselves from the organization, denying any involvement. The public outrage was deafening. People were demanding answers, and the authorities were forced to act. But for Daniel, the victory fell hollow. The organization was unraveling, yes, but Emily was still gone. She had been a victim of this dark world, and even though he had uncovered its secrets, she remained lost. He had exposed the monsters, but the damage had already been done. Months passed. The legal battles began. Some members of the group were arrested, while others vanished into the shadows, their influence still far-reaching. Daniel continued his search, his resolve unwavering, but the toll of the past years weighed heavily on him. He couldn't help but wonder if Emily had ever known the truth of what was happening to her. If she had been caught in the web of deceit, knowing she couldn't escape. And then, one day, there was a breakthrough. It wasn't much, just a small clue, a piece of a puzzle, but it was enough to keep him going. It was a letter hidden away in a place he had never thought to look. Emily's handwriting, clear and strong, her words full of hope. She was alive. The truth had come to light, and so had a new chapter of Daniel's journey. The fight wasn't over yet. Emily was still out there, and no matter how long it took, Daniel would bring her home.